Okay, now we're looking at intelligence, and this whole last portion now will be intelligence. We're looking at a definition of what intelligence is, and we're going to look at theories of intelligence, and we're going to go into looking at just briefly how we test for intelligence and variations in that. And then lastly, what we're going to touch base on is creativity and its relationship to intelligence. Are they related or not? Now, when we think about intelligence, we often think about really smart people, and yet there's a lot of examples of intelligence that seems to be contradicting that. Now, maybe you've seen the movie Rain Man. That movie is based on the story of a person who really does live, and his name is Kim Peeks. And Kim Peeks is thought to be one of the most intelligent people who's ever lived, in part because of a disability. And if you go Google, use YouTube and find out about Ken Peeks, you'll find some videos about him, and he's a remarkable person. Everything he reads, he remembers, and he recalls in an instant. Everything. He has like an open brain to accept new information. He's been doing it all of his life, and yet he can't look after himself. He needs 24-hour support. He has the ability to read a book both pages at the same time. Left eye reading the left page, right eye using the right page. Now, he's unable to look after himself, 24-hour support he needs, and yet he has the capacity to take in any amount of information, music, books, anything, and store it, and then bring it out and use it. Now, why would he not be considered intelligent? In some respects he is, but in all aspects of life, maybe not so much. So we're going to look at what is intelligence then, and how do we measure it.
Okay, we're looking at intelligence, and here's a basic definition of intelligence. We're going to look at some theories as well, but the individual's ability to understand complex ideas and to adapt effectively to the environment and to learn from experience and engage in various forms of reasoning and overcoming obstacles by taking thought. And so it may not have been what you thought it was. It may be a little bit more complex or slightly different than you thought, but there has been a lot of dialogue about intelligence, and the theories of it have shifted quite a bit over some time. So let's have a look. This is Charles Spearman, and he took this definition and thought about the mental effort that was being done, and he had what he called the G factor. And the G factor was his term, Spearman's term, for the general intelligence ability that underlies all mental operations to some degree. The G was for general. And people who were bright in one area tend to be bright in all other areas, was his theory. Now, there was what he called an S factor, or specific intellectual abilities, and Spearman's influence seen in intelligence tests such as the Stanfordbinet that yielded an IQ score that indicated the level of general intelligence. And so this was the initial sort of stage at looking theoretically at intelligence. Now, Thurstone, he followed up with what he would call the primary mental abilities. And he had what he would refer to as 7 relatively distinct capabilities that, either by themselves or in combination, were involved in all intellectual activities. And, verbal comprehension, numeracy, or looking, being able to play with numbers, spatial relations. This is being able to sort of organize thoughts in your head, multiple ideas, organized spatially. Perceptual speed, how quickly you can perceive things and make understanding about the world around you. Word fluency, memory, and reasoning. All intellectual activities involve one or more of these areas, and believes that a single IQ score obscures more than it reveals. He really didn't think that a single IQ score would give a very clear representation or a very accurate representation about someone's intelligence. He suggested a profile instead, indicating what areas were strong and what areas were weak. Now, this started to grow an idea about intelligence that had some variability to it, that it wasn't black and white and brought to a numerical number. Now, some work that was done more recently that really sort of expands the idea of intelligence was Howard Gardner's Now, it used to be 7 intelligences, but now it's been added to be 8 frames of the mind. And he looks at a variety of elements. And really what he's saying is that there's less of a focus on factors that underlie intelligence, and there's more focus on the types of intelligence. And he's listed 8. This developed the theory by studying patients with different sort of brain damages, including savants, and affects some form of intelligence but leaving others intact. So for example, a savant, an example of that would be Ken Peekes, Stephen Whitshire. Stephen Whitshire has the ability to be taken anywhere to see anything. He was taken up over the city of Rome in a helicopter and came back down and spent 7 days drawing it in extreme detail and was very, very accurate. He has a photographic memory at a very high level, but he has other deficits in terms of his intelligence that, but he's got an extremely high skill level in another. By studying savants, a combination of mental deficiency and unusual talents and abilities, believes that all forms of intelligence are equally important, doesn't value one over another, and cultures assign varying degrees of importance of intelligence to these types of intelligences. If you look at the range there, you have linguistic intelligence, which is around words, logical mathematical intelligence around mathematics and numbers, spatial intelligence, being able to juggle multiple perspectives in mind at one time, the ability to use images to represent spatial information, body kinetics, someone who's good with their body, a dancer, an athlete, musical intelligence, somebody who seems to have a facility to play number of different instruments or have thinks in musical terms. Interpersonal intelligence, someone who's engaged with other people a lot, likes to talk, is very good with social environments. Intrapersonal intelligence, somebody who's much more into themselves, and I don't mean that in a bad way, but they are very introspective. And then naturalistic intelligence, somebody who has a real flair for the natural environment, a child who's overwhelmed with interest when it comes to spiders and ants and insects, could be an example of naturalistic intelligence. Now, another theory is Sternbergs' triarchic theory of intelligence, and he looks at sort of in components. He has an analytical part, an experiential part, and a common sense part. So the computational intelligence would be what he would describe as kind of book smart, the analytical part. And then the experimental intelligence would be more the creative and insight sort of experience. And then contextual would be the common sense or street smarts component. And he's sort of looked at it in 3 ways. He argues that IQ test performance and real-world successes are based on 2 different types of knowledge. The formal academic knowledge, the book smarts, is what someone might do well on an intelligence test, but someone who's more contextually based may not do as well on an intelligence test, but might be able to negotiate the world around them as well, if not better, than someone else with a higher IQ. So I've touched on just a couple of theories here, really, but we've introduced this concept about testing and intelligence testing. And how do we do that, and how is it done effectively? Now, the intelligence test, one of the first, was Stanfordbinet's intelligence scale. The more current one is known as Stanfordbinet version 5. And it's a test that you get tested individually. You're not done in a group. And the IQ test is done to anyone from the ages of 2 to 23, and you get an overall IQ score. That is to say, there's multiple areas. There's 4 subscales, and you get tested on verbal reasoning, quantitative reasoning, abstract visual reasoning, and short-term memory. Now, as with many tests, there are norms, and these are standard basis based of the way the range of the scores in large groups of people who are selected to provide a basis for comparison for those who take the test later. So norms would be the establishing of ways of delivering the test so that the experimenter doesn't somehow influence the testing of an individual. The intelligence quotient, or the IQ, is an index of intelligence. So when you get an IQ score, it's an index of intelligence originally derived by dividing the mental age by the chronological age. The mental age is the age in which you would be scored out as if, um, and the chronological age would be your real age, and then it's multiplied by 100, now derived by comparing the individual score with scores of others of the same age. That's how it's done now. It's not done in that formula anymore. Now there's been enough people who have had this test in varying age that your score is compared to other people of your age. And then that's how you're evaluated, if you will, in terms of the Stanfordbinet. Now, it's not the only test out there. There are many other tests. The Wechsler is a common test used for both adult and children. The California test for mental maturity, the cognitive abilities test, the Canadian cognitive abilities test, and the Otis Lennon mental ability test. These are all intelligence tests. The Wechsler is the first successful intelligence test for adults. It's most widely used for psychological tests. Some jobs require you to have an intelligence test and along with other testing, and this would be the test they would use. Scores are based on how much an individual deviates from the average scores for adults, not the mental or chronological ages. And it compares verbal and performance subtests, which are the nonverbal as well as verbal. And it's administered one person at a time by a psychologist or an educational consultant.
So how do we know whether an intelligence test is a good test? Well, there's 4 criteria we look at: reliability, validity, standardization, and culturally normative or culturally fair. When we think about reliability, what we're meaning is that the question asked is understood the same by all people and by the same person 2, 3, 4 times in a row. And so sometimes what they'll do is they'll offer the test and then offer it again and offer it again, and all 3 times the question needs to be understood in the same way. And that makes it reliable. Validity, it ensures that the test tests what it's supposed to. And so if it's an intelligent test, it needs to be able to measure intelligence. And so they'll test to see that it's in fact doing that, as opposed to testing something different, computation skills. Well, it's not just about computation skills, it's about intelligence. So they check that. If it is, it's called valid. Standardization really just means that there's a set of norms, codes of conduct of how to make the test available, so that I, as an experimenter, can't inadvertently bias the results of the test by saying something in the intonation of my voice or the way I deliver the question or alter the question. It needs to be done in a very standardized way, the same way every time, making it standardized. And culturally fair just means that the test needs to be able to go across culture. Can't have a favoritism based on the quality or the content of the question that favors one culture over another. It needs to be culturally neutral. And that way, then, it's available and it's reliable and it's a good test for all people in all cultures as best as possible to measure intelligence and not something else.
Now, requirements for a good test. This is what's called the bell curve, and it's also known as the normal curve. And the majority of the scores cluster around the mean. The mean is in the middle, and that's where the bump in the curve is. And that's where the majority of the scores would fall. The furthest away from the mean scores, and there's fewer of them, less than 2% are classified as genius or as mentally handicapped. And so this is often how scores would play out and how they would bell curve scores. Now, I mentioned about intellectual disability. Now, your textbook referenced the term mental retardation. I've used it because it's in the textbook, not because it's a desired term, nor is it the term that's used typically in Canada. This is an American term. It's often viewed as a negative connotation term being used in terms of how Canada views it. It's the measure, it's basically a subnormal intelligence. Now, it's not the most desirable way to be playing it, but it is based on IQ scores in the typical format. And it's reflected by an IQ score below 70 by adaptive functioning severity deficiency for one's age. So what you're seeing here is a breakdown of, by IQ score, the normal if you will, sits at about 100. 90 to about 110 is a range of normal. And so when you see the mildly, moderately, severely, and profoundly, you're getting an idea of the distinction, or the categories, if you will, of intellectual disability. So the kind of comments that are in your textbook and are represented in the slide are really more based on what you see out of the United States, even though this is a textbook that has a Canadian flavor to it. Now, part of what we've just looked at is IQ scores. And this has, for almost a century, been the predominant way of measuring intelligence. And yet, when we talk about successful engagement in employment, there's another score that seems to come up, or at least another concept that is introduced, and it's called emotional intelligence. And this refers to our ability to manage not our intelligence via skill set, but through our ability to navigate successfully interpersonal dynamics. Our ability to have an argument with somebody and still be able to work effectively with somebody. And so this is to do with our social environment. The ability to apply knowledge about emotions to everyday life. Argue, that emotional intelligence is just as important as outcome variables as IQ tests. In fact, many employers really don't want to know about how smart you are. They can teach skills you need that way. They want to know that you can be an effective worker and manage your emotions well. So the personal aspects of emotional intelligence is awareness of emotions, that you've got them and that you are responsible for them. They're your emotions. And management of emotions, not letting your emotions override your intelligence. Managing them, knowing when it's appropriate to express them and how is it appropriate to express them. The interpersonal aspects of emotional intelligence include empathy, a sensitivity for other people's emotions and feelings, and ability to read others' nonverbal behavior. All people express nonverbal behavior, but not all of us are able to understand what it means and how to respond effectively. And managing those relationships is to manage the give and take in a social relationship, the way we have to manage our own feelings and be sensitive to others. Now, the last area I want to touch on in the area of intelligence includes this concept of creativity. This is the ability to produce original, appropriate, and valuable ideas and or solutions to problems. And there is a way that you can develop creativity, or strategies, if you will. And here's 4 stages about creative problem solving. And the first is to prepare. That is just to search for ideas, get some of your resources together to help you solve the problem. Let the issue incubate, letting the problem sit for a while, allowing relevant information to digest, not trying to do all things at the same time, allowing things to sort of percolate, if you will. Illumination is being, oftentimes when you allow things to percolate, ideas start to enter into your consciousness, and this would be considered illumination. And then translation would be taking these insights that you get and applying them to some form of action to solve the problem. Now, intelligence, high intelligence doesn't necessarily mean high creativity. Genuine creativity rarely appears in sudden flashes. Usually, you do things to prepare for creativity. It doesn't just sort of pop into your mind constantly as this is just, I'm just creatively inspired all the time. And so when we look at creativity, there's a couple of ways we introduce this, and we've touched on this already before. Convergent thinking and divergent thinking. When we think about it in terms of divergent thinking, this is the ability to produce multiple ideas and answers or solutions to a problem which there is no agreed upon solution. So divergent thinking just means there's no particular solution. You've just gone outside the box to look for ways to solve the problem. And being creative enables you to be outside that box and find solutions. whereas convergent thinking consists of solving precisely defined logical problems for which there is no incorrect answers. It's like math. This isn't how I feel about math, but people who are good at math say math is easy because there's a solution. There's an answer. You follow the right computational process, there is an answer. And so for them, that's convergent thinking. Whereas coming up with ideas for a party would be divergent thinking, where you use your creativity outside the box. So I hope this has been helpful. This has been Chapter 2. We're wrapping it up, and good luck on the rest of the semester. Don't forget that the journals will open. Check your syllabus for the journal openings. It's all in the syllabus there. I'll open up the journals for 2 weeks, pretty much 2 weeks each time the options are available. All right, have a good day.